Thank you and welcome to our presentation today on the history and heart of 3 Points. We hope you enjoy the results of our research. We discovered so much that we were unaware of as current and former residents of 3 Points. If you live or have lived in 3 Points, and I asked earlier, but let me see a show of hands of how many of you have lived in 3 Points? Wow. How would you answer these questions? You should be able to answer them. By the end of this presentation, you'll have the answers if you don't know them right now. How many of you have driven on Winona Road? Oh, there's a couple. How many of you have walked on Minnetonka? How about this one? How many of you have hunted pheasants on Shadywood Point? Before we start talking about 3 Points in the olden days, let's talk about 3 Points in 2022, and we'll head back in time after that. Since some of you have never heard of 3 Points, or you may have heard of it, but never been there, let me explain where 3 Points is. You are located right here where the star is, and you can see as the crow flies, 3 Points is about a mile, maybe. If you travel down Shoreline Drive to downtown Mound, turn right and go up to 3 Points Boulevard, you are now, that's a current view of that intersection, and that's a Shell station now. Lots of you have known it as a PDQ for the years, but also it was gas hut for lots of the old timers, and even Skelly gas station. Have to ask one of the early residents about that. Following east on 3 Points Boulevard, you'll come to the Seahorse condominiums. The Seahorse condominiums were built originally as Marina Manor apartments in 1965 and later were converted to condominiums. There are 6 3-story units located on 13 acres of prime lakefront property on Jennings Bay, which today make up 138 individually owned condominiums. With all the boat slips and the indoor swimming pool and other amenities, it was really on the cutting edge 57 years ago when it was built. Following further east on 3 Points Boulevard, we'll come to a building that sits between the intersections of Eagle Lane and Finch Lane. If you go to the back of that same building, you'll see it's a location today of the Tonka Alano, and it has been for quite a number of years. You can tell that simply because it does not have a 952 in front of that 472 phone number. That changed a long time ago too. Here's another one, as the caption says, it was literally taken, this picture was taken out of left field. It was taken from 3 Points Park in the left field, 2 blocks away looking west. So you can see the building circled there. 3 Points Park has been used for over 100 years as a park for adults and children to play everything from kitten ball in the early days, softball, baseball, basketball, tennis, as well as to have picnics, the infamous or famous fish fries, and even bingo and sing-alongs. Also, and one of our residents that doesn't live out there anymore said there was an elephant out there in probably the 70s or 80s. There's somebody raising their hand. We don't have a picture, unfortunately. These 2 locations make up of what we call the historical heart of 3 Points, and they were the center of business and recreational activity going way back many decades in 3 Points. This will be much of the focus of the rest of this presentation today. Before we look at 3 Points Peninsula, let's talk about the Lake Minnetonka bays that surround 3 Points. On the top, you'll see Jennings Bay. Jennings was named after Frederick A. Jennings, a printer from New York and an early settler. To the south, on Harrison's Bay, Nathaniel Harrison was named after Nathaniel Harrison, who was a shipbuilder from Virginia. And over on the left, West Arm Bay is named mainly because of the geographical location on Lake Minnetonka. Here's an early 1850 map of Minnetonka Township, which Mound was carved out of many years later and shows the location of the properties that were owned by Jennings and Harrison. Notice Jennings did not actually own the property on what is now 3 Points. That was Harrison. Here's 2 examples of the many smaller steamboats that ended up cruising on Lake Minnetonka, providing various services. Harrison actually contributed to their design and build. The May Queen, a fourth steamboat on Lake Minnetonka, and the Mary. Huge, huge boats. 3 Points is divided into 3 main subdivisions, and we'll refer to them throughout the presentation. First is Woodland Point, which is adjacent to Dreamwood. That formed one part of the platting of 3 Points, and then Shadywood over to the right. Most of our focus for the remainder of the presentation will be on Dreamwood, with a small part of Shadywood, since those are the areas most associated with what we're referring to as the heart of 3 Points. This is a map that's not very easy to read, but you can see Dreamwood and Woodland and Shadywood are clearly labeled, and you can see that there was a road that was called Navajo that separated Dreamwood from Woodland, and then the road named Minnetonka separates the 2 subdivisions from Shadywood. The Dakota tribe of Native Americans lived in this part of Minnesota before the treaties of Mendota and Traverse de Sioux allowed the European pioneers and settlers to stake claims west of the Mississippi. This, of course, included the Lake Minnetonka area. This is a close-up, a little bit closer up, that you can see the actual Native American names of the streets. And now you can see that Winona Road, which separates, is 3 Points Boulevard. So how many of you now have ridden on Winona? I should have everybody's hand up now that's driven out there. Some of the other translations of the North American names: Winona translates to firstborn daughter. Tankahara refers to free spirit or highly attractive. Tecumseh was actually a warrior in the Shawnee tribe who organized an American Indian Confederacy to help stop white settlement. And Tetonka refers to big black for buffalo. Interesting, you'll see swastika. Swastika has been used for thousands of years, predating Hitler's unfortunate use. It was a spiritual symbol for various tribes. And the Navajo were actually a different tribe that lived 1,500 miles from Mound. You can see at some point the people that lived out there with those names eventually started calling the lanes 1 through 8. We don't know when that happened, but one of the residents told me that in 1935 he lived on lane 1. As a project for the JCs, the bird names came into being, and local resident Jim Regan received recognition for his work on this special committee. He thought that choosing avocet over albatross was a good choice for the bird starting with the letter A. And if any of you live on avocet, you probably appreciate not being on albatross lane too. This map shows the old Native American names with the current bird names, and now it's very clear that if you've driven on 3 Points, you've driven on Winona. And if you've been on Gull, especially visiting 3 Points Park, you've walked on Minnetonka. Notice that the road that separates Dreamwood and Woodland was changed from Navajo to Jennings, one of the original pioneers and namesakes of the Bay. Some keynotes in 3 Points history. In 1853, the 1851 treaties with the native Dakota finally allowed settlement west of the Mississippi River. The treaties between the U.S. government and the Dakota were ratified by Congress in 1852, but hung fire until February of 1853, opening the door for settlement west of the Mississippi. Matthias Cook and John Carman settled in Mound in 1854 on the present-day Cooks Bay, and those of you that live in Mound will know that that's Surfside Park now. In that area, there were seven hotels in that area, I've been told. In 1854 and 1856, Frederick Jennings and Nathaniel Harrison settled in 3 Points respectively. Here's a picture of what the pioneers looked at when they came out to 3 Points, probably in the early days. Probably not, maybe a little earlier than that. They literally came out of the wilderness. The Big Woods, as this larger area was called, was a thick deciduous forest, and the trees had to be cleared to make wagon trains and to build log homes and to farm the land using horses and oxen and even mules. Animals were plentiful for hunting, and there was unlimited amount of fish. The Minnesota winters, however, were terribly cold. The hardships were too much for some went back east, and some went back to the old country. Some additional information on history of the area. In 1862, That's when the US-Dakota War occurred in Minnesota. It was a frightening time both for the settlers and for the local Dakota. Some frightened settlers went to Big Island for safety, I've been told. In 1863, the Dakota were expelled from Minnesota, and the Indian Removal Acts required the Minnetonka Dakota to leave the Lake Minnetonka area that they had frequented to hunt, fish, harvest wild rice, and sap for maple syrup since the 1700s. From 1893 to 1897, economic depression hit the country, and it contributed to the end of what they call the glory years of Lake Minnetonka. The railroads came in, they took tourists further and further west. In 1906, the golden years arrived with streetcars in Excelsior, streetcar boats in Big Island Park, and the golden years of Lake Minnetonka brought renewed life until the horseless carriage, which was the automobile, and improved roads changed everything. Here's some photos taken in those old days on the glory years on the top. The Chapman House Hotel, one of the 7 hotels around the lake. The Hotel Lafayette, this particular picture, it burned down in 1897 and was replaced again with 2 Lafayette clubs. And the most current one, I think, was built in the 30s, but it still stands in the lake, or on the lake in Minnetonka Beach. Below that is a picture of the Minnehaha streetcar boat, and some of you have ridden on this boat, even though it was really in existence only from 1906 to 1926, when it was scuttled and then brought back up in 1979, I've been told. And I know that we have one of the captains of that boat here in the audience today. And the bottom right is Big Island Park, which served the lake from 1906 to 1911. The bigger steamboats would not fit over on West Arm Bay, and so some smaller steamboats were created. This particular one is the Florence M. Deering, named after, by the way, Deering Island, Captain Charles Deering. It's right off the point of Shadywood Point in 3 Points. They provided transportation to and from. If you worked in Minneapolis, you maybe came out on the weekends and stayed and then went back on the streetcar boat on Monday morning and went back to work. It had package delivery. Even Donaldson's department store delivered packages from there in those years. There was food delivered, mail delivery, and then of course the wonderful, wonderful boat trips that for all the social groups that were in existence at that time. Early roads were in very poor condition until paving came along, and at that point other types of transportation came into being. In 1908, the Woodland Point and Dreamwood subdivision was platted by the American Suburbs Company. It came with a promised electricity, running water, believe it or not, telephone service to come, and here's a picture of that Woodland Dreamwood. It came with a very particular kind of platting in that every lot equally owned the lakeshore, and they were called commons at that time. So you'll see up at the top the Wawanosa Commons and the Waurika Commons for Woodland Point, and the Wyoda Commons for Dreamwood. Separation of Minnetonka was Minnetrista. On the right-hand side, you'll see Shadywood Point, which actually was platted in 1912, and that was a bigger company. Gillespie, it was Dickinson and Gillespie. They were based out of California that came in with impressive advertising and enticement to buy land. And for those of you that live in the area, Gillespie was the grandfather of Bill Gillespie, the namesake of the Gillespie Center here in Mound. This is a copy of the rules and regulations, because each one of those subdivisions had their own governing group that ran, operated, and provided all of the necessary things to keep those rules in effect. There were only 5 rules. The biggest one, if you see there, is on garbage and junk. And the bottom line is that you had no right to throw it in the street or on your neighbor's property. You couldn't stay up any later than midnight. If you did, you had to shut your mouth, because that's when the noise rule came into effect. And that included the bathing on 3 Points, or on Woodland Point Beach. Docks, there was docks that were provided by the organization that were for anybody to use. They were called community docks. Any of the launches for hire were not not allowed to be on there any longer than 30 minutes. If you rented your cottage, and many of the people did, you could only rent to people you knew, because if you can read that, and I'll try to read it, the value of your property and all properties in the community are decreased by tenants who have no respect for the rights of others and who are a nuisance in the community. How many of us were there, huh? The associations would govern the land until Woodland Point, Dreamwood, and Shadywood Point were annexed to Mound in the late 50s and early 60s, but more on that later. Here's a copy, actually, of that again, and we found that in our outhouse, although this picture is not our outhouse, but it's identical to ours on Bluebird Lane, and no, that is not me in that outhouse. But it's also a reminder that it took quite some time for the city sewer and water to be available and hooked up to the seasonal cottages and homes on 3 Points, as well as to the larger area. Here's a picture that shows you kind of the gravel roads in that area. They were an improvement over what the pioneers had to deal with. They would have found a few Native American trails that would have become early horse and wagon trails, and some of which later became early roads. This early sign pointed to the 3 main subdivisions. Where do you think this might be today? If you guessed Shell gas station, you're absolutely right. This picture shows facing north, going out to the high school and to Hilltop School, and there's the Shell gas station. Remember, Mound and St. Bonifacius were 2 of the towns carved out of the township of Minnetonka, which means crooked water in the native Dakota language. Here's another picture of the initial roads, taken probably back in the 20s. They were, of course, dirt and gravel, and they were often very difficult to travel on during the spring of the year with horse and buggy and eventually Model T Fords and early vehicles. Where do you think this road is located today? Anybody remember? That was 3 Points Boulevard again, looking towards Mound, in Mound, and that was the future Dove Lane, for those of you that live on Dove Lane. Here's a picture that was taken the other day, and it will show Dove Lane the way it looks today. Notice the road was flattened out in later years and eventually became paved with asphalt. Here's something that was really of great interest to me since I read the newspapers from the early years. There was a small hotel called the Woodland Inn. It was located in Woodland Point. It could have been either on Woodland or on Bluebird, what's Bluebird today, or on Dove. We're not quite sure, but it was owned by Henry Holquist of Saskatchewan, Canada, and it opened each year on May 15th and closed on September 15th. The Woodland Inn was still appearing in the newspaper articles and the social columns through 1913, so we knew it was still in existence in those years. Jitz Miller, who grew up in 3 Points, reported that his grandmother Brulette owned a resort on what is now Avocet, Bluebird, and Canary, and this would have been on the Dreamwood side of those lanes. In 1922, a last-ditch sales pitch to sell Shadywood lots expected more than 5,000 people to attend with free food and drinks and airplane rides. Yes, airplane rides. It was reported that over 60 rides were given out on that day. Here's a close-up of that same ad, and kind of interesting because with realty and how you glorify the land you're selling, it says this is the last of the rare, unspoiled woodland peninsulas where health, happiness, and wholesome sports reign supreme. The only modern subdivision of this type on Lake Minnetonka, and the last. Ooh, you had to come out and buy. Here's some of the amounts that it costs. You could get, in Shadywood, you could get a lot for as low as $325, probably $1 down and $1 a month. In today's dollars, that is a little over $5,000. But the supreme lots, and you should have been back there to buy them, were the 1 acre main lake frontage lots, which sold for $925 and up, and they would have gone for less than $15,000. There weren't addresses out there at that time, but everybody had names over their cottages. This particular one is actually hanging over our door on Bluebird Lane. My husband found it when he was remodeling, and it was in gold leaf, and so he boxed it in and glassed it over to preserve it. But some other examples of cottage names, One was the Swiss Chalet, which was on Swastika Lane, which would be Finch Lane today. And that one was actually owned by the mayor of Minneapolis, who lived out here for very many years, and he kind of used it as a hideout from the political reporters at the time. We all appreciate that. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Cozy Nook, Limberlost, Navajo Cottage, Summer Breeze, Totem, and my very favorite, Azy Come and Azy Go. Early cottages were generally very small. This particular picture I took in 1967 on Bluebird Lane. It was identical to our cottage when we remodeled it a year later. But that was on a 40 by 80 lot. It would have been condemned by the city, so you couldn't build on it. But later, about 2 years ago, it was replaced with this $1 million home on the same lot with an additional 15 feet of property. In 1959, Mound annexed the western part of 3 Points. That included Woodland Point and Dreamwood, and you'll see the vote was 140 to 84. So it really wasn't exactly 100% for sure, 62% as a matter of fact. In 1963, Mound annexed Shadywood Point, which actually was part of Orono, not Minnetonka like the other. The driving factor there was the opportunity to have city water, sewer, and fire service. By the way, that group, the Shadywood Point, complained lots because they had to pay $300 a year for fire service up until that point, if you can imagine. I mean, for the whole area, not per house. By the way, they only paid at the most $9 a year for electricity, water, and a $2 fee to belong to the organization over those years. Lots of progress happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. On Palm Sunday, March 26, 1961, Mound's new city manager, Leonard Kopp, and a part-time building inspector went out to 3 Points and condemned 120 cabins. Bring them up to code or tear them down. So we lost lots of those original ones in those years. The Mound Council had committed to improving services to 3 Points, which included city sewer, water, fire protection, graded streets, electricity, telephone, and community docks. In the 1970s, brought additional paving of the residential streets, and in the 1980s, brought additional curbing and guttering. My 3 Points research included the Minneapolis Tribune social column, which we were part of every single week from 1908 until 1913. The Minnetonka Pilot, the Westonka Historical Archives, and the History of Mound, Westonka History Society, Levon Adams' wonderful work. A name that kept popping up over and over as I read this, looking for the heart of 3 Points, was the name Philbrook. I saw it over and over, and then I found out that actually Stephen Philbrook, who doesn't live in Mound anymore, but was doing history of his own family. And so I asked him if he'd come on board today. He has lots of pictures, and that really, really took my heart for sure. So please help us welcome Stephen Philbrook.
Good morning. In telling the story of the Philbrook family moving to 3 Points, I'm going to be drawing on family stories, an interview that Jethro Philbrook did with the local newspaper back in 1969, and notes that I found on the back of a bunch of photographs. You saw this picture earlier. This is what 3 Points would have looked like when the Philbrooks would be coming out there. Before they moved out to 3 Points in 1920, they'd been visiting the area for quite a while. Frank's uncle, a guy named Oscar Stetzer, owned a cottage that would be sitting on what today is the corner of 3 Points Boulevard and Gull Lane. This is a picture of the cottage taken probably in the mid-teens. It's a place they'd come out from the cities to go fishing with friends, bring people out to entertain, and to do some hunting in the area. Question was brought up earlier. This is a picture of my grandfather, Frank Philbrook, and his water spaniel, Nippy, and out for a day of hunting out on Shadywood Point. And it looks like he had a pretty good day pheasant hunting that day. He could literally walk out the back door of the cabin and they'd be into Shadywood, and at the time it wasn't very developed, so there was hunting on Shadywood Point. Before moving to 3 Points, the family lived in northeast Minneapolis, where Frank ran a saloon. His family on his mother's side had been in the saloon business for a couple generations. He attended bar for one of his uncles, and in about 1913, he bought this building on 1101 Main Street, and him and a partner opened up their saloon. And here you can see Frank and his trusty hunting dog, and some of his Northeast friends dressed to go hunting, very possibly heading out to 3 Points. In 1919, Prohibition passed. Enough states had passed it that Prohibition was going to be going into effect in January 1920. So this meant that Frank was going to have to come up with a different way to support the family. He'd been in the saloon business for years. Something was going to change. And at the time, Frank and Anna had 2 children, a daughter named Florence, who was 17 at the time, or 15, excuse me, and a son, Jethro, who was 7. And Anna at the time was expecting their 3rd child. She'd be born later that year, and her name would be Cecilia Ann. So the Philbrooks, they probably had time to think about it because Prohibition took a while for it to get passed through the states. And they came up with the idea that they'd move to 3 Points and open a grocery store. So with the building completed and the family moved in upstairs, the Woodland Point Dreamwood Grocery Store opened on May 20th, 1920. This is probably the earliest picture of the store in that building that sits out there today. The story is that the first sale of the store was a 5-cent box of matches to a guy named Otto Palmer. Otto was a good friend of Frank's. So according to Jethro, in the early days when they got out there in the 20s, there were only 5 families that lived on 3 Points year-round. So when he started delivering the Minneapolis Journal, in the wintertime, he'd have 3 papers to deliver. Come about the 4th of July, summertime, it could be up to 100 papers because of the crowds that would show up in the summer to the cottages. It's another view of the same building, still back in those early days. And here you can kind of see a close-up of what the sign would have looked like. In the early days, they still had to travel into the cities a lot to supply the stores. So Frank and his young son Jethro would take the Model T Ford pickup truck into the city about twice a week to the markets in the summertime to pick up fresh fruit and vegetables for the store. This is the truck. On this day, it's being used to give his sister Florence a ride around with her friends. And if you look, you can see somebody sitting behind the steering wheel. You can hardly see over it. That's very possible Florence's younger brother, Jethro, probably about 10 years old at the time. But by the mid-20s, later 20s, the summer population had grown enough out on the point that the Northland Transportation Company extended their service from Mound out to the store. And it's a pretty early picture of one of the buses. Here's another one of the buses from back in those days. By 1929, Northland Transportation Company was renamed the Northland Greyhound Transportation Company. And within a couple of years, it just became the Greyhound Bus Company. Here's a picture of the Philbrook family from about 1930. And you can see Frank and Anna, Florence, Jethro, and Cecilia Ann, or as I would get to know them, that's Grandpa, Grandma, my Aunt Florence, my dad Jethro, and Aunt Celia. By that time, Florence had married a gentleman named Harry Horton Jr. Harry's the photographer that took these pictures that I'm sharing with you today. When Shadywood Point was platted, a section of land was set aside for a park. And Jethro recalled in the early days working on the park when he said it was nothing much more than swamp, reeds, and cattails. But with time and improvements, the park was able to start having some activities. Here you can see a pretty early ball game and a pretty good attendance of spectators to watch. But it was still in pretty rough shape. It looks like if you hit the ball into the outfield, it probably would get lost in the weeds, and you know, it's probably pretty good for the batter, not good for the outfielders. This sign was added down to the entrance at 3 Points probably around 1934. And if you look close, you can see there's an addition on the top. There's a new arrow pointing to Philbrooks. And this is because there was a change happening in the country. Prohibition was ending. So after 14 years and Prohibition going out, the Philbrooks put an addition on the back of the store. And if you look close, you can see the addition on the back. And here's a close-up of the sign. That was when Philbrooks Bar was added to the back of the store. Here's close-up of that same shot. You can see the entryway, which would have been the side back door entry to the store in the early days, but now also is the entry to the bar in the back. Jethro was given the responsibility of running the bar. He was a couple years out of high school, early 20s, and grandfather turned the business over to him. And grandfather recommended one thing, and that was that he close the bar at 11 o'clock, because he said by then people had been there long enough. And it's probably something he learned from his years of experience running the saloons in Northeast Minneapolis. In 1935, a gas station was added. So close-up of the gas station. Back then, there were full-service gas stations. I don't know how many people are familiar with that. If you get out west, Oregon has full-service gas stations, but you don't see them around here. So what that meant was you'd pull up to the gas pumps, an attendant would come out, ask you how much fuel you wanted. As he's filling it up, he'd be washing your windshield. If you wanted, he'd check your oil for you. You know, back then, for 20 cents a gallon, that was a darn good deal. I don't know what to say about this picture. That's Jethro, and he's certainly enjoying himself, and you'll get introduced to the young woman a little later. So the Three Points Park Association, part of how they would raise funds to keep the park up and improvements was their annual picnics, summer picnics. This is a picture probably around 1936, 37, and you can see a pretty good procession of cars, got a fire truck in there, getting ready probably to head into Mound to get people to come out to the park for the day. Close up, you can see the banners on the vehicles, says 3 Points Picnic today, Shadywood Point. So one of the improvements that came fairly early was they were putting in a flagpole. So here's some of the locals working on getting the base for the flagpole. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see there's still a sign from the Dickinson and Gillespie Company, still selling many beautiful lots out on Shadywood Point. And if you look down, you can see the fields looks like it's improved. You even got some bleachers kind of down in the lower area there. So. And here they are pouring the cement. You'd be looking at Gull Lane is in the background there. That cottage up there in the corner is the one you saw earlier where the family used to come out to in the early days. That's the one that was owned by Frank's uncle, Oscar Stetzer.
That was my house.
Was it? Yeah. Okay. We'll talk about that later. So with the improvements, here's a parade that was led by the Daughters of the Union Veterans. It was on April 30th, 1938. The parade was going from the store to the park for dedication of the flag. Following the adults were these children, that local 3 Points children. The two little boys in the front are Clayton and Jitz Miller. I was hoping Jitz would be here today. I don't see him. Had an opportunity to sit and visit with him a few weeks ago and had some wonderful stories. Jitz and his family lived down on Lane 1 of Woodland, or Dreamwood, excuse me. So here's the daughters of the Union veterans gathered up at the park. So if you look at the flag, you can see the dates on there. It's 1861. So this was daughters of the Civil War veterans is what the organization was. Their units were called tents, which this was the Mound tent. And in doing research, I found there was an active tent in Minneapolis, and I emailed them, and the lady found a newspaper clipping in the Minneapolis Tribune about this dedication at the park in 1938.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So with the dedication of the flag, this is Maud Wells of the DUV presenting the flag to Les Woods. Les was the president of the Park Association at the time. So with the improvements in the park, the Philbrook Bar sponsored a softball team. That's my grandpa, Frank, in the middle of the group of players. And if this picture was in color, you'd see that I'm wearing one of the jerseys today. This is an original mid-30s jersey from the ball team. So my dad had given it to me years ago, and it's been tucked away. You can see it was their home field, because obviously their name is prominent on the top of the scoreboard there. The bar also sponsored a couple bowling teams. This is the men's team. They bowled at the alleys at the casino, which the casino was down on Cooks Bay. Now it's Chapman Place condominiums, so down by Surfside Park. It was a Surfside when I grew up out there, and they had dances upstairs, bowling downstairs, food, refreshments. So this is 1939. They won the championship that year for their league, and they're sitting with one of the trophies, the bowling pin. My dad's on the upper right-hand corner there, Jethro. So they had back-to-back victories, 1939 and 40, and there's the trophies for them. The trophies are at the Westonka Historical Society. And, you know, if you win back-to-back trophies and you're sponsored by a bar, you get to celebrate a little. So there's the team. So the bar also sponsored a women's bowling team. They bowled over in Long Lake at the Buckhorn, which the Buckhorn's been gone for quite a few years, but I remember it as a kid. They had a great gun collection in that building. On the left is Dad's younger sister, Celia, and the woman in the middle, she's the one that was at the gas pumps with Dad a little earlier on, so we'll introduce you to her now. On one of the nights that Jethro closed the bar down at 11 o'clock, he'd head down to meet his buddies down in Spring Park at Skunk Hollow. And he walked into a place called Tom and Charlie's and spotted a young woman named Mary Lou Bradley. And Mary Lou had come out for the summer to look for work, and she was hired on by a guy named Charlie Ward. Well, they took a liking to each other, started spending more time together. There's a couple shots of them out in front of the store. And you can see here things started getting pretty serious. So the store was kind of like a city center on 3 Points. It's a place where you could be and watch the comings and goings of the residents of 3 Points. And they were observed and documented quite well by Harry and Florence Horton with their camera. And here's a few pictures of just some of the shots that were taken around the store out in the parking lot. This is a young girl probably waiting for her mom that was in shopping. Her name was, she was a Wingstern, Von Seal Wingstern. 3 young girls that are probably in to shop for some ice cream or candy. If you look real close, the sign above them is the shape of an ice cream cone, and it was from Helgren's Dairy. Helgren's was over in Maple Plain. And here, you saw the Miller boys earlier. They were leading the parade on the flag dedication. Well, here's the Miller boys again, Schitz and Clayton, and their little sister, Fan Sean. And a local mother, I hope somebody might be able to recognize her with her little kids coming to the store probably to do some shopping. Guy home on leave, where do you go? Go to the bar, meet your buddies, have a beer. And, you know, the neighbors would come in to show how they did on the lake that day. Picture on the left is my grandfather, Frank, with his buddy Otto Palmer. Otto's the one that bought the box of matches from Grandpa when the store opened back in 1920. And I'm not sure who the other gentleman is. Again, anybody that can recognize these people, talk to me after. And to show that it wasn't only the men that got out fishing, here's a picture of my grandmother and my Aunt Celia, and a darn good looking stringer of fish that day. So, like the store was a city center, the bar was kind of a community center. and there was things going on there from time to time. There was weekly card parties that continued on for years, and bigger things like this celebration. This was a St. Patrick's Day party. You can see people with their party hats on, meals being served, refreshments. Field close behind the bar, you can see that's my grandfather, Frank. That's Jethro, my dad, and Cy Huff. Cy married Jethro's younger sister, Celia. So another change came, and that was with World War II. And with the U.S. entering the war, Jethro was being inducted into the Army. 29 years old at the time, and time to go serve his country. This is a going away party that they held in the bar for Dad. Well attended by the local neighbors and friends. That's Dad with his arm around his mother, my grandmother. So the family headed down to Fort Snelling. This would have been March 11th of 1942 to say goodbye to Dad. That's his parents with him, Grandma and Grandpa. And his younger sister Celia with her husband, Cy Huff. And his older sister, Florence, and his girlfriend, Mary Lou. And there he is, climbing on the train at Fort Snelling, headed out to California for training in the artillery, and then he'd be off to the Pacific, where he spent most of his time, much of it on Macon Island. So with Jethro gone, Mary Lou moved in with the family so she could help out in the store. This is the only picture I've been able to find of the inside of the store at the time. That's Grandpa with his back. He's at the cash register. Mary Lou's in the middle, and Grandma on the right, weighing something up on the scale. So it's kind of fun to see what was on the shelf back in 1942. Some familiar products. Got Rice Krispies, Kix, Jell-O box down there in the corner. I looked close, and this is log cabin syrup. So a lot of the stuff's still around today. Packaged different, probably smaller servings, cost more. So in the spring of 1943, my grandfather had some health issues, and the family decided that it was just too much to run the store. So they put the store up for sale. The son of the local beer distributor, a guy named Mel Jensen, Mel and his wife, Muriel, bought the store and moved in May of 1943. And Grandma and Grandpa, Frank and Ann, moved across the street into a house that was adjacent to the gas station. And Mary Lou moved back into Minneapolis with her younger sister, Elizabeth. The Jensens kind of kept the tradition going, having parties. This is a Christmas party from 1943. When we visited with Jitz Miller a few weeks ago, he was able to go through and recognize and name a bunch of the people. That's Jitz there. Don Ulrich. Don was mayor of Mound for a few years. And a couple more Ulrichs, his brothers, these two with the plaid shirts on. And this young lady down here is Fanshawn Miller, the younger sister of the Miller brothers you saw on the slide a little earlier. But I've got some prints of this picture, and we've named some of them. Anybody that knows any of the kids in the pictures, maybe you were there, come and talk to me after. So the Jensens ran the store for about 2.5 years, and in 1945, they decided it wasn't for them. And the store was sold to Charlie and Olga Ward, Pete Ward. Charlie Ward was the guy that had the bar in Spring Park that my Lou Bradley went to work for back in the early 40s. The store became known as Ward's Store. This period of time I knew. I grew up in Mound, or in 3 Points. I was born in 1950. So I remember going to the store, the Ward boys, Roger and Greg, playing with them. They had this great bowling shuffleboard game in the bar that you had the little discs you'd slide and go over little metal wires, and the pins would pop up. Fun playing. Story about the gas station. And I talked to Don Wassell just recently, in fact, yesterday. We had moved up to Dutch Lake area at the time, and I've seen a picture of me on a bicycle, a little bicycle, 20-inch wheels. But I remember getting my first full-size bicycle, and it was a used bicycle that my dad bought from one of the Osell boys, Don Osell. And when I talked to him here a couple weeks ago, he said, "Didn't you or your brother get my bicycle?" And it's like, yeah, I did. So the Wards ran the store until 1959. They sold to a couple named Paul and Bernice Ostrov. Ostrov family moved in, and the store became Paul's store. I spent a lot of time out on 3 Points during those years because I had a friend that lived out there, so I also spent time in the store during the Ostrov period. For me, the time period gets a little sketchy as far as how long people owned it, but after the Ostrovs had it, they sold to Howard and Dee Gerard, and they ran it as Howdy's for quite a few years, I guess. The Gerards sold it to a couple of brothers that grew up out on 3 Points, the Tacheks, Bob and Butch. I went to school with Bob. After they had it for a few years, Roger Rager bought it, and the bar became Rager's Pub, and he operated it for a number of years. And I'm sad to say, it's about the period I got out of the Army. Raising a young family, I never did get into the building to have a beer in Rager's Pub or my grandfather's bar. And then in 1988, the building was sold to Tonka Alano, and that's the organization that still owns the building today. So while things were going on at the store, there's still activities down at the other end of Dreamwood, and that was at the park. And this is an early picture. I don't think it's the hill at the park, but it's out on 3 Points somewhere. This is John Jolly Gelsrud. And I put it in because it reminds me of the hill on the east side of the park. And I remember as a kid out there, that hill seemed so steep and so long. And I get out there nowadays and look at it, and I have to laugh because, there ain't much to that hill. This is a picture of a 1959 baseball team. So the bar was no longer sponsoring teams, but Mound or 3 Points still had their teams. And here's the pictures I mentioned. This is Coach Adorf, Fritz Sohl. This gentleman is Ron Kohlberg. Ronnie and his family ran the dry cleaners and the laundromats in the bar for many years. And next to Ron, and I'll point him out because he's been a friend of our family for years, a guy named Jimmy Nelson. Some of you might know the Nelson family. The next couple of slides are some paper clips that came out of the paper in the 60s. This was a thank you from the Park Association to the local businesses that helped sponsor the picnic that year. Reading through it, I mean, there's so many familiar names. It's just kind of fun to go down. Ronnie's Cleaners, you see in the middle on this side. This is a fun little ad. I think the graphics are great. It's for a fishing contest that was sponsored by the Park Association. And they had prizes for men, which, they get bold print for some reason, ladies and kids, but, This is an early picture. That shelter, it stood up in the corner by where the flagpole was, so it would have been on the corner of 3 Points Boulevard and Gull. And it was there for quite a few years. Here it looks like it's probably a sing-along. I see some open mouths, and they're all looking at songbooks. But I remember it when I was young out there as a place where they'd set up for the bingo games. I mean, they'd call in bingo out of that building. So I am getting near the end of my slides, and I want to share a couple fun facts with you. So as I said, after 3 years and 9 months, Jethro found his way back to 3 Points. And Mary Lou had waited for him all those years. And on May 14th, 1946, they were married at the Catholic Church at Our Lady of Lake Church in Mound. And I wish he was here today. Jitz Miller, his name's been mentioned a couple times, but Jitz was one of the altar boys at their wedding. So the other fun fact is, here's a picture of Dad and Grandpa behind the bar. When Grandpa closed the saloon in Northeast Minneapolis in 1919, he took the bar out of the building. He sold the building, took the bar out, and put it in storage. And when they opened the bar on 3 Points in 1934, the bar was put into that building. And I happened to get in there a few years ago. I stopped out there on a Saturday, and I met up with the guy that allowed me in, and this is a picture of me standing behind the bar. The bar is still in the town, in the Alano building. So it's kind of like it's in Prohibition again, you know? It's in storage, waiting for another day. This last picture, we're going to open ourselves up to more questions, if there are any. The three women here, this is a picture that we learned Jitz Miller had donated to the History Society. And the two women on the left are unidentifiable, but the woman with the balloon at her mouth asking for questions happens to be Jitz's grandmother, Grandma Amberg. So I wish Jitz would have been here today because he showed up a lot through the history of 3 Points. This is a picture of that Christmas party. You can see Brad has kind of put some bubbles by him. I've got some printouts over here. If anybody wants to look at the pictures, thinking they might recognize somebody in them, it'd be fun to add to our notes of who might be in the pictures. So he did it with the baseball team too.